The glass in my hand stayed perfectly still, yet the world around me seemed to shatter in total silence. I have spent a lifetime memorizing the faces of my enemies, but I was entirely unprepared for the face of this child, under the unapologetic glare of the California sun, amongst the elite and the untouchable. I looked down and saw my own history staring back at me. I didn't recognize his name. I didn't recognize his home. But as the boy named Zion tilted his head, I recognized my own eyes, staring out from a face that shouldn't have been mine to claim. The Pacific Ocean shimmered like a sheet of crushed diamonds through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Malibu Coastal Gallery. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the light is so bright it feels heavy. Choi Sung-ho stood alone in the north wing, his presence commanding the room without a single word. He wore a charcoal gray suit tailored with such precision it looked like a second skin, the fabric carefully concealing the intricate, dark ink that climbed his collarbone, to the world. He was a billionaire venture capitalist with a penchant for rare art. To the few who knew the truth, he was the iron fist of a legacy he never asked for. He was there to view a minimalist sculpture, something cold and structural, but his attention was diverted by a small figure standing near the entrance. A young boy, perhaps 10 years old, was dressed in a crisp white polo and khaki shorts, looking at a painting of a lone pine tree. The boy's skin was a deep, beautiful bronze, his hair neatly faded. Sung-ho felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the child, an instinct he usually reserved for danger. As if sensing the gaze, the boy, Zion, turned his head. The air left Sung-ho's lungs in a silent rush. It wasn't just the shape of the nose or the set of the jaw. It was the eyes. They were a rare, piercing amber with a distinct, darker ring around the iris, a genetic anomaly that had been in the Choi family for 4 generations. Sung-ho had never seen those eyes on another living soul, until now. He watched, frozen, as the boy gave a small, polite nod, a gesture of innate stoicism that mirrored Sung-ho's own, before a woman stepped into the frame. Tasha moved with a grace that suggested she was used to being the calmest person in any room. She wore a sun-yellow dress that caught the afternoon light, her expression guarded yet serene. She placed a gentle hand on Zion's shoulder, her eyes sweeping the room until they landed on Sung-ho. There was no gasp, no dramatic drop of her handbag. Instead, her gaze held his with a terrifying, knowing weight. In that bright, silent gallery, the past and the present collided. Sung-ho didn't move. But for the first time in his life, the boss felt like a man who had been discovered. "Hello, friend, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments so I can know the part of the world you are watching from. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you won't miss out on new videos." Now let's go deep into the story. Huntington Botanical Gardens was a sanctuary of sculpted nature, a place where the chaos of Lowe's angels was muffled by the rustle of rare bamboo and the trickle of koi ponds. Under the relentless, gold-leaf sun of a California morning, Choi Sung-ho walked the gravel paths. He looked like any other wealthy patron of the arts, his stride rhythmic and controlled, his hands tucked loosely into the pockets of his linen trousers. But his eyes, those sharp, amber-flecked eyes, were not on the flora. They were locked onto a small, energetic figure 50 yards ahead. Zion was crouched by a bed of blue lotus, a sketchbook balanced on his knees. He wasn't running or shouting like the other children. He was observing. He moved with a quiet, deliberate focus that sent a chill down Sung-ho's spine. It was the same focus Sung-ho used when calculating a merger or a retaliation. Every few minutes, the boy would tilt his head to the side, a specific, unconscious habit of the Choi men when they were deep in thought. Sung-ho felt a ghost of a smile tug at his lips. A sensation so foreign it felt like a physical ache. "He doesn't like to be disturbed when he's drawing structures," a voice said, cutting through the heat of the day. Sung-ho didn't flinch. He turned slowly to find Tasha standing beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree. She looked like a vision of peace in a white sundress, but her eyes were like flint. She wasn't holding a weapon, yet she was the first person in a decade to make the boss feel completely disarmed. "He has a talent for seeing the bones of things," Sung-ho replied, his voice low and gravelly, like stones shifting underwater. "Most people only see the petals. He sees the architecture." Tasha stepped closer, the dappled sunlight dancing across her face. She didn't look away from him. "He gets that from a ghost, A man I knew a long time ago who thought the world could be built with enough logic and enough steel. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the scent of jasmine and the unspoken weight of 10 lost years. Sung-ho wanted to ask 1,000 questions. When did you know? Why didn't you call? Does he know my name? But he was a man of restraint. He simply watched Zion. The boy had finished his sketch and was now looking up at the sky, squinting against the sun. In that light, the boy's profile was an undeniable silhouette of Sung-ho's own father. "I am not a ghost, Tasha," Sung-ho said softly. "To us, you were," she countered, her voice steady, devoid of the anger he expected. Instead, there was only a weary, protective grace. "A man with your affiliations cannot exist in the sunlight, and my son belongs to the sun." She began to walk toward Zion, her silhouette glowing in the midday heat. Sung-ho stayed in the shadows of the oak, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that no gang war had ever achieved. He watched her lean down and whisper something in the boy's ear. Zion looked back over his shoulder, his gaze finding Sung-ho's. For a fleeting second, the boy waved, a small, innocent gesture that felt like a bolt of lightning hitting the ground. Sung-ho stood frozen. A tattooed king in a garden of secrets, realizing that his empire was nothing compared to the sketch in that boy's lap. The Santa Barbara Polo and Racquet Club was a landscape of prestige, where the grass was manicured to the millimeter and the air smelled of expensive leather and sea salt. It was the kind of place where money spoke in whispers. Sung-ho sat on the terrace of the private clubhouse, a glass of iced tea sweating on the table before him. He had spent a fortune to ensure he was invited to this specific youth equestrian clinic. He wasn't there to buy a horse, he was there to buy a moment. Down on the field, Zion was mounted on a small, sturdy pony. He wasn't the most experienced rider, but he sat the saddle with a rigid, natural elegance. He didn't look afraid, he looked calculating. He was studying the rhythm of the horse, his hands steady on the reins. Sung-ho watched through silver-framed sunglasses, his mind racing. He saw himself in the boy's posture, the refusal to show weakness, the quiet dignity in the face of a challenge. "You're an expensive man to keep track of, Choi Sung-ho," Tasha said, appearing at the edge of the terrace. She was dressed in a crisp, navy blue blazer and white trousers, looking every bit as elite as the regulars, though her wealth was measured in peace, not blood. "I find that the most valuable things often require the most effort to find," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. Tasha sat, but she didn't relax. She watched Zion execute a perfect turn on the field. "He's been asking about you, since the gallery. He says he feels like he's seen you in a dream." Sung-ho felt a tightening in his throat. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were an old friend of the family, a man who builds things." Tasha turned her gaze to him, her eyes searching his face. "Tell me, Sung-ho, are you still building things, or are you still tearing them down? I see the way your men watch the perimeter of this club. I see the armor you wear even when you're in the sun." Sung-ho looked down at his hands. His knuckles were scarred, a history of violence etched into his skin, hidden now by the elegance of his linen sleeves. "I am transitioning. The world I come from is a heavy coat to take off, Tasha, but seeing him, seeing those eyes, it makes the weight unbearable." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats. Zion was riding toward the terrace, a bright, triumphant smile on his face. He hopped off the pony with a grace that made Sung-ho's heart skip. The boy ran toward the table, stopping just short of the stairs. He looked up at Sung-ho, his chest heaving from the exertion, the sunlight catching the amber in his eyes. "Did you see?" Zion asked, his voice full of a child's pure, unadulterated pride. "I kept my heels down, just like the instructor said." Sung-ho stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the table. He stepped to the railing, looking down at the boy who was his living legacy. For a moment, the boss disappeared. "I saw," Sung-ho said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Your form was perfect. You have the balance of someone who knows exactly where they are going." Zion beamed, a smile so bright it felt like it could heal every scar on Sung-ho's soul. "Mom says you're a builder. What do you build?" Sung-ho looked at Tasha, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and warning. He looked back at his son. "Right now, Zion, I'm trying to build a bridge." The sun dipped low over the Pacific. casting long, amber fingers of light through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of Sung-ho's estate in the hills of Montecito. This was his sanctuary, a fortress of white stone and silent water features that cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. But tonight, the silence felt heavy. Sung-ho sat in a leather armchair that smelled of expensive cedar, a single dossier resting on his lap. He didn't need the lights on. The moonlight reflecting off the infinity pool was enough to illuminate the grainy, 10-year-old photographs tucked inside. He traced the edge of a photo of Tasha from a decade ago, standing on a balcony in Seoul, her hair caught in a summer breeze. They had been young, and he had been a man caught between two worlds, the brilliant architecture student and the heir to a throne of shadows. He had chosen the shadows to protect her, or so he had told himself. He had staged a disappearance, a cleansing of his past life that he thought was a mercy. He never knew that as he was walking into the darkness of the syndicate. She was walking into the light of a new life, carrying a part of him he never knew existed. Sung-ho stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghosting against the glass. He peeled back his silk shirt, revealing the intricate black ink that coiled around his ribs, a dragon's tail, a symbol of a rank he now found loathsome. Every scale on that dragon represented a debt, a deal, or a hard-won victory, but as he looked at his own reflection, he didn't see the boss. He saw the eyes of the boy at the equestrian club. Zion didn't have scales, he had dreams. He moved to his desk and picked up a heavy, leather-bound book. It wasn't a ledger of accounts or a list of rivals. It was a rare, first-edition collection of blueprints from the world's greatest cathedrals and skyscrapers. He ran his thumb over the gold-embossed spine. He remembered the way Zion's small hands had gripped that sketchbook in the botanical garden. The boy didn't want toys or cheap distractions. He wanted to understand how things stayed standing against the wind. "Min-jun," Sung-ho called out, his voice barely a whisper yet carrying across the vast room. His most trusted associate stepped from the shadows of the hallway, a man who had bled for the Choi family for 20 years. "Yes, sir." "This book," Sung-ho said, holding it out. "I want it delivered to the address in Topanga. No guards, no black SUVs, use a standard courier. And Min-jun," he paused, his gaze hardening, "if a single person from the organization follows that courier, they will answer to me personally. Do you understand?" Min-jun bowed low, his eyes reflecting a flicker of surprise. He had seen Sung-ho command armies, but he had never heard this tone, a mixture of desperate protection and burgeoning hope. "It will be done, sir." As Min-jun retreated, Sung-ho turned back to the window. The stars were beginning to pierce the California sky. He realized that wealth was a hollow victory if there was no one to inherit the spirit behind it. He wasn't just a man with a name anymore. He was a man with a legacy that was currently sleeping in a small house miles away, dreaming of structures he hadn't yet built. Sung-ho realized that to be a father, he would have to learn how to stop being a king. The following Saturday arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted. Tasha had chosen a public park in Pasadena for their meeting, a place filled with the sounds of laughter, the smell of cut grass, and the rhythmic thump-thump of a basketball on a nearby court. It was a place where secrets felt out of place, which was exactly why she had chosen it. She sat on a stone bench draped in ivy, watching Zion kick a soccer ball with a group of local kids. Sung-ho approached slowly, dressed in a simple white linen shirt and dark jeans. He looked remarkably ordinary, save for the way the air seemed to still around him. He sat at the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long time, neither spoke. They simply watched the boy. Zion was a natural leader on the field, directing the other children with a quiet confidence that didn't need to shout to be heard. "He received the book," Tasha said finally, her voice soft but firm. "He spent 4 hours last night tracing the arches of the Notre Dame. He asked me if the man who sent it was a master builder." Sung-ho felt a pang in his chest, a mixture of pride and a devastating sense of fraudulence. "And what did you tell him?" Tasha turned to look at him, her gaze tracing the lines of his face, searching for the boy she once loved in the man who now sat before her. "I told him that you were a man who understood the importance of a strong foundation, but that you were still working on your own." She leaned back, her fingers tracing the ivy leaves. 10 years ago, Sung-ho, I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I saw the ink starting to crawl up your neck. I saw the way you stopped looking at the stars and started looking at the exits of every room we entered. I couldn't raise a child in a room with no windows. Sung-ho closed his eyes, the warmth of the sun feeling like a physical weight. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I became the strongest, no one could touch what was mine. But you became so strong you became untouchable, Tasha countered gently. Even to me, even to your own son. She paused, watching Zion score a goal and cheer with his teammates. He thinks his father is a builder who had to go away to work on a great project. In a way, he's right. You've spent 10 years building a fortress of shadows, but Zion, he lives in the light. If you want to be in his life, you have to come out of the dark, completely. Sung-ho looked at his hands, the hands that had signed orders that changed lives and ended futures. He looked at Zion, who was now jogging toward them, his face flushed with the pure, honest joy of a Saturday afternoon. The boy didn't see a mafia boss. He didn't see a billionaire. He saw a man who had sent him a book about how the world stays together. I have already begun to dismantle the organization, Sung-ho said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the park. It will take time. There are risks, but for those eyes, I would burn the fortress to the ground. Tasha reached out, her hand hovering over his for a fraction of a second before pulling back. It wasn't a gesture of reconciliation yet, but it was a bridge. Then start with the truth, Sung-ho. Not the whole truth, he's only 10, but the truth of who you want to be, because he's already looking at you like you're the blueprint for his future. Zion reached the bench, beaming, and wiped sweat from his forehead. Are you staying for the next game? He asked, looking directly at Sung-ho. Sung-ho stood up, the sunlight catching the amber rings in his eyes as they met Zion's. I'm staying as long as you'll have me, Zion. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The morning sun poured into the high-tech boardroom of the Choi Holdings skyscraper in downtown Los Angeles, turning the glass table into a blinding lake of light. Choi Sung-ho sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Around him sat the council, men who had spent decades navigating the gray space between corporate dominance and underworld enforcement. The air was thick with the scent of expensive espresso, and a tension that felt like a sharpened blade. The rival faction in the north is moving on the shipping lanes, boss, one of the elders, a man with a jagged scar across his knuckles, muttered. They think you've gone soft because you're spending your weekends in public parks. They expect a response, a cleansing. Sung-ho looked at his reflection in the polished wood of the table. He thought of the science fair invitation tucked into his breast pocket. The one Zion had handed him with sticky, chocolate-stained fingers just 2 days ago. He thought of the way the boy had explained the tension of a suspension bridge using a handful of popsicle sticks and wood glue. There will be no cleansing, Sung-ho said, his voice a low, steady hum that silenced the room. We are liquidating the shipping interests, all of them. By the end of the quarter, Choi Holdings will be a strictly real estate and urban development firm. Legal, transparent, audited. A shocked silence followed. These men didn't understand the architecture of a new life. They only understood the sword. You're dismantling a kingdom for what? The elder asked, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. For a woman and a boy who don't even bear your name. Sung-ho stood up, his silhouette framed by the sprawling, sunlit city behind him. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it was absolute. I am dismantling a cage, so that my son never has to learn how to live in one. If any of you wish to remain in the shadows, do so on your own time. But as of today, the Choi name belongs to the light. He walked out of the boardroom, leaving the sword behind. He drove himself to the local middle school, the bright California sun glinting off the hood of his car. When he entered the gymnasium, it was a cacophony of children's voices and the smell of floor wax. He found Zion standing proudly next to a model bridge. The boy's face lit up with a brilliance that no diamond could match. You came, Zion whispered, his amber eyes wide with surprise. Sung-ho knelt down, ignoring the dust on his expensive trousers. He looked at the bridge Zion had built. It was sturdy, humble, and held together by something more than just glue. I told you, Zion, I'm a man of my word, and this is the most important structure I've seen all year. In that moment, among the school projects and the cheering parents. Sung-ho realized that his throne hadn't been a seat of power, but a seat of isolation, as he helped Zion reinforce a loose popsicle stick. He felt the weight of the organization slipping away, replaced by the simple, heavy responsibility of being a man a child could look up to without fear. The afternoon sun was mellow and golden, casting long, peaceful shadows across the school's outdoor amphitheater. It was the end-of-year awards ceremony, a quintessentially American scene of folding chairs, fluttering programs, and proud families. Tasha sat in the third row, her hand resting over her heart, her eyes never leaving the stage. Beside her sat Sung-ho. He wasn't hiding today. He wore a light blue shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal the lack of weapons, though his tattoos peeked out from his wrists. A map of a past he was finally outrunning. The principal began reading the names for the Innovation and Integrity Award. When Zion's name was called, the applause was deafening. The boy walked across the stage with that familiar, stoic grace, his head held high. He accepted the trophy and turned to the crowd. His eyes scanned the rows until they found his mother. And then they shifted to the man sitting beside her. Zion didn't go back to his seat immediately after descending the stage. Instead, he walked straight toward the third row. The crowd seemed to fade into a blur of color and light as the boy stopped in front of Sung-ho. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was a bridge being crossed in real time. "Why do you look like you've been looking for me your whole life?" Zion asked. His voice small but clear, echoing the intuition of a child who sees through every mask. Sung-ho felt a crack in the iron discipline he had spent 30 years perfecting. He looked into those amber eyes, the Choi eyes, and saw the future staring back at him. He didn't see a boss or a successor. He saw a boy who deserved the truth, even if the truth had to be told in layers. "Because I was lost, Zion," Sung-ho said, his voice thick with an emotion that made Tasha's breath hitch. "I was building things in the dark, and I didn't realize I was looking for the light until I saw you standing in it." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and placed it on Zion's shoulder. It was the first time he had truly touched the boy as a father. There was no lightning bolt, no dramatic music, just the warmth of a young boy's shoulder and the steady, grounding presence of the sun. "Are you going to stay lost?" Zion asked, his gaze searching Sung-ho's face for a promise. Sung-ho looked at Tasha, who was wiping a stray tear from her cheek. He looked back at his son. "No," he whispered. "I've finally found where I'm supposed to be. I'm not going anywhere." Zion nodded, a single, sharp movement of his head that mirrored Sung-ho's own mannerisms perfectly. He didn't need a grand explanation of the Mafia or the millions of dollars. He just needed to know that the man with his eyes was finally home. As the ceremony continued around them, the Mafia boss and the black boy he had never seen sat side by side, two pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place under the vast, forgiving California sky. The California coastline was bathed in a soft, ethereal lavender as the sun began its slow descent into the Pacific. High on a ridge in Topanga Canyon, a new structure was rising. It wasn't a fortress or a hideout, but the skeleton of a community youth center, all clean lines, sustainable timber, and massive panes of glass designed to invite the sky inside. Choi Sung-ho stood on the dusty ground, a hard hat resting on a nearby crate. He was dressed in a simple work shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. The organization was a memory dismantled piece by piece through legal maneuvers and a massive redistribution of wealth into legitimate trusts. There had been those who resisted, but Sung-ho's transition had been surgical. He hadn't used a blade. He had used the very architecture of the law to fence them out. Now, his hands were covered in the honest dust of a construction site rather than the cold chill of the shadows. Tasha walked up the incline, carrying 2 bottles of cold water. She paused, watching him. The tension that had defined her posture for 10 years had finally begun to dissolve. She looked at the rising beams of the center and then at the man who was funding it, not with blood money, but with the liquidated remains of a past he had finally buried. "Zion is in the trailer," she said, handing him a bottle. He's trying to convince the foreman that the cantilever on the north wing needs another 3 inches of support. He brought his own ruler. Sung-ho laughed, a sound that was no longer rusty or forced. He's probably right. He has an eye for the stress points. He sees where things are likely to break before they actually do. He gets that from you, Tasha noted softly. She stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his, under the bright, open sky. There were no more secrets. The Mafia boss was gone. In his place stood a man who was finally learning how to breathe. He's happy, Sung-ho. He doesn't just have a father. He has a hero who builds things. That's a powerful thing for a boy to have. Sung-ho looked at his hands. They were calloused and tired, and they were clean. He looked at the horizon, where the blue of the ocean met the gold of the sun. The reunion was no longer a moment of shock in a gallery. It was a daily choice to stay in the light. I spent so long thinking power was about what you could take, he mused. I didn't realize it was about what you could leave behind. As the work whistle blew, signaling the end of the day, Zion came running out of the foreman's trailer, clutching a set of rolled blueprints. He looked at Sung-ho with an expression of pure, uncomplicated belonging. He didn't see the tattoos or the history. He saw the man who was building a future for kids just like him, as the 3 of them stood together on the ridge. The silhouette they cast against the setting sun was one of total resolution. The bridge was finally built. 5 years later, the sun shone with a particular brilliance over a university campus in Northern California. The air was filled with the scent of eucalyptus and the hum of 1,000 voices. It was commencement day. Zion, now a tall young man with a confident stride and the unmistakable amber-flecked eyes of the Choi lineage, stood among his peers in a black graduation gown. He wasn't just receiving a degree. He was receiving the Young Architect of the Year, award for a sustainable housing project he had designed for underserved communities. In the front row sat Tasha and Sung-ho. Tasha looked radiant, her hand tucked into the crook of Sung-ho's arm. Sung-ho wore a well-cut suit, but he didn't look like a man trying to hide. His silvering hair caught the light, and his expression was one of profound, quiet peace. He was no longer a ghost or a king, he was a father. When Zion's name was announced, he stepped onto the podium. He took the microphone, his gaze immediately finding the 2 people who had given him the world. I want to thank my mother, who taught me that the strongest foundations are built on love and truth, Zion said, his voice steady and resonant. And I want to thank my father, a man who showed me that it's never too late to change the blueprint of your life. He taught me that we don't just inherit our past, we build our future. As the crowd erupted in applause, Zion looked directly at Sung-ho and gave a small, knowing wink, the exact same gesture Sung-ho had once used to signal his silent approval. In that moment, the cycle of shadows was officially broken. The legacy was no longer one of secrecy and ink, but of glass. Light and the enduring strength of a family finally found. Under the vast, golden canopy of the American sky, the man who recognized his own eyes in a stranger had finally found himself.